Hello, this video is going to walk through the basic ideas behind the United States Constitution and looking at what the Constitution does. We're going to start on the bigger picture side, and we're going to focus on the 5 basic principles of the Constitution. As we go through the remainder of the year, we're going to focus more specifically on the different branches and different roles and powers and things that the government has. We're going to start with some big picture ideas called the 5 principles of government, which are federalism, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, and popular sovereignty. These are the 5 basic principles that guide and drive the United States Constitution and tell us basically how our government is supposed to function. These are also 5 things you're going to find on your graduation test. These 5 principles will be revisited all year, so we'll continue to talk about them as the year goes on. We're just looking at a basic definition and description of what they are now, so we can lay that foundation for the remainder of our year together. Let's start with federalism, which is one of the very important parts of the United States government because it divides the power of the government between a national or federal government and a state and local government. So when the Constitution was written, we are shifting from the Articles of Confederation, where there was a central government and a state government, but where the state government had the majority of the power, and the central government was extremely weak and had very little power. As we learned, that didn't really work well for the United States under the Articles, and the Articles failed, and the Constitution is going to replace it. The Constitution is going to increase the size of the federal government's power and creates a federal system of government. And that simply means that the power is divided or shared between the national and the state governments. So there is a United States government and there is an Ohio State's government. There's also local governments in the cities like Cleveland or Strongsville. So power is divided and shared. That means that the federal government can do certain things that the states cannot, and the states can do certain things that the federal government cannot, and that there are certain things that both the federal and the state governments can do together. We'll get into more of those details later on, but make sure you understand that the basic concept of federalism is that the power exists on both a national and a state level, and that power is divided and shared. The second basic principle of government that we're going to look at is the idea of limited government. And this is very significant because it states the fact that the government must follow the laws, that the government is not above the law. So looking back on history, we talk about monarchs and kings, people who had tremendous amounts of power, people who abuse that power, which typically does happen when you put power in the hands of one or a few people. It's very important that we establish the idea of a limited government, that the government itself must follow its own laws, must follow the laws as stated in the Constitution. And we can see this concept of limited government when we look at the preamble to the Constitution, which starts with the 3 very famous words, "We the people." I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but "we the people" is a statement that we, the American people, created this Constitution. The power that the government has originates from us, and that we empower the government. We give the government its power, and we do that so that it will do the following things for us. Just like the preamble says, we want the government to form a more perfect union, to bring our country together and make it perfect if possible, to establish justice, to have laws that we will make our lives safe and hopefully just, to ensure domestic tranquility, to keep the peace, to provide for the common defense, to protect us from threats outside of ourselves, to promote the general welfare. So hopefully the government will support our growth and our development and our success. Not welfare in terms of government assistance, that's something else. Secure the blessings of liberty, to make sure that we're all free and equal, to ourselves and our posterity, to the people that come after us. And the last line says, "do ordain and establish." So we the people of the United States, comma, and then it kind of jumps to the end. We do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America. We do this. So that idea of limited government is where the power originates from the people, and that the government itself is responsible to us and also must follow the laws set up by the Constitution. The next basic principle of government we're going to look at is separation of powers. Ever since you're in kindergarten, you've learned about the 3 branches of government. And again, if we look back at history, we know that if one person holds all the power, they typically abuse that power. So in terms of the separation of powers, we're going to divide the power of government up into 3 different branches in order to prevent the abuse of that power. And those 3 branches of government, of course, are the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. And the purpose and function of the judicial branch is to interpret the laws. We'll talk a lot more about that as we go. The purpose and function of the executive branch is to carry out the law, and of course the legislative branch makes the laws. So the powers of the branches are very important. We need to know what those are, and we will explore those in lots of detail later on. But as a principle of our government, we know that the powers of the government we have just created have been divided into different branches. And once we divide those powers into 3 different branches, we have to create a system to make sure that those branches can function together, which brings us to the next principle of government, which is the idea of checks and balances. That if those 3 branches are going to be separate, they also have to work together, though, in order to make our government function. And we need to make sure that each branch has the ability to check or to monitor the other branches. So the idea of checks and balances is that there's a system in place to make the government work together, and to give each branch the ability to check the actions and powers of the other 2. The easiest one to think about is how a bill becomes a law. It is proposed in the legislative branch. It is signed into law by the executive branch, and that law can be ruled unconstitutional by the judicial branch. We'll look in a lot more detail later on this year about specific checks and balances, but that's usually the easiest one to think of. And the last of our 5 basic principles of government is popular sovereignty, and this kind of goes back to the idea of limited government. Popular sovereignty means that the power belongs to the people, that the people are sovereign, that they have power, and that the government's power is derived from the people. And again, that's reinforced by those 3 words at the start of the preamble, we the people. So that's popular sovereignty, and that takes us through our 5 basic principles, but there's one more that's not really a basic principle that I want to make sure we understand, that the United States is a representative democracy, and in our current project we're talking about the power of voting and how we impact our nation through the voting process, and that's what representative democracy is, that voters elect representatives to serve in the government and to send them to places like Columbus and Washington, D.C. to represent us, their constituents. So we vote here in Ohio District 9 for somebody to represent us. Currently that's Marcy Kaptur. And she goes to Washington, D.C., and she sits in the U.S. House of Representatives, and she votes and debates laws that are passed for the nation. And that's representative democracy. That's what we do here. We send people to City Council to do that. We send people to Columbus to do that. We send people to D.C. to do that. That is the basis of our government and how that works. So the 5 basic principles of government, one more time, are federalism, that power is divided between a national and a state government. Limited government, that the government is not all powerful and that it must follow the laws that it creates, and those laws are in the Constitution. Separation of powers, to prevent the abuse of power, the government's power has been divided into 3 different branches. To make sure that things work effectively and efficiently, we balance those powers and we check those powers between those 3 branches. And that we have popular sovereignty, that people have the power through their votes, through their election of their representatives. We, the people, drive the government. So that wraps up the 5 basic principles of government. Again, we're going to talk about these all year long, and it's very important that we establish them now so that we can reference them as the year goes on.